It's with great pleasure today that Dr. Goodyear and I welcome Dr. Celia Falikov. She is truly an outstanding leader in the field and has done incredible work. Has written multiple books, including this one, Latino Families in Therapy, second edition. She's internationally known. She does family therapy training and multicultural training internationally. In addition, she is a clinical professor in the Department of Family and Preventative Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry at UC San Diego. And she's also director of mental health services in the student-run free clinic. She's past president of the American Family Therapy Academy and a fellow of the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy and the American Orthopsychiatric Association. She's received awards for distinguished contributions to family therapy and is truly exceptional. I feel very close to Dr. Falikov because we edited a book together on supervision and multicultural and diversity. So we're so very fortunate to have her with us today.
Well, good morning to everybody. Thank you so much, Carol, for that very generous introduction. And I'm not very experienced with webinars, but I hope everything is going to go well technically. The task is complex for me today, and for all of us really, when it comes to multiculturalism and diversity and social justice. Because first I have to define for you how do I interpret or construct the notion of culture? Because many people who write on these topics use different interpretations of what culture is. And what I mean by a complex task that is multi-layered, because we have to talk about the relationship between the client and the therapist as being a cultural encounter, and also the relationship between the supervisor and the therapist or the clinician, and then this three part of being family or client, therapist, and supervisor. So I hope I can illustrate that by following with each one of the things that I'm going to say, an illustration of one case throughout, so that you could see the application of this. So let me go to share screen so I can start the PowerPoint. And let's see. Oh, sorry. Okay. Are you with me? Is everything
perfect?
On the screen? Okay. So I'd like to start with perhaps something that you have read, if you have read the first edition of the Latino Families in Therapy book. And it's a case that was a very inspiring case to me as a very new graduate in the 1970s, when I was called as a translator to a hospital where a 7-year-old Puerto Rican boy had recently been operated for congenital heart disease. And his great aunt, an elderly woman, very humbly dressed, sitting next to him and clutching a rosary, was at the hospital when I walked into the room. The nurses and the doctors had grown to dislike her very much. And they talked to me before going in, saying that I had to tell her to stop bringing greasy food into the hospital, that the boy needed to eat the hospital food, that she needed to move him around more, that she was letting him be in bed for a long time and was being overprotective and perhaps even fatalistic with praying all the time. And so they had begun to blame her for the poor recovery of the boy. They had already called a psychiatrist to the scene, and the psychiatrist had written in the chart that he thought that the great aunt overprotectiveness was probably due to a reaction formation from a psychoanalytic point of view to her hostile negative wishes towards the boy because of her age, feeling overburdened by having to take care of him as his only caretaker. And so the scene was, oh, sorry, I moved it without meaning to yet. So it was a difficult situation for everybody, and I had tried to think compassionately about both sides. Why did I do that? Well, a child was dying, and that's a universal human tragedy without any question. And so each one of the players, say, in this situation was using their coping mechanisms, the ones that were learned, particularly in their professional settings, like the psychiatrists or the nurses and the doctors. But none of them was aware at that time, perhaps today it would be different, that they were coming from different models of family organization, different models of how to deal with a child that is sick, and what are appropriate expectations that are developmental expectations. But in addition to them not understanding the cultural diversity involved in that, also the fact that the great aunt was seen as a woman of color, as aged, which she was. She was probably in her 60s, but even looked older than that. And so they ignored a power dynamic that was based on race, class, gender, and immigrant status. She was clearly an immigrant. She did not speak English. She only spoke Spanish, and that's why they had called me to be a translator. And so this dynamic rendered the great aunt unable to protest or complain. A middle class or upper class white mother would have said, wait a second, doctors, this kid is really not doing well. My child is not recovering from the operation. Is there something that is being missed? What can be done? Well, the great aunt was silenced. And so what I would like to talk about is that this encounter of cultures had a tremendous impact on me at that time. I was young, I was new to the profession, and I started really thinking differently about what is it that we're providing people with our frameworks. So this was an encounter of cultures where, now I do want to go to this, and social location. We had the hospital staff, the pediatrician, the pediatric cardiology surgeon, the consulting psychiatry, and the nurses. That's the hospital staff. Then I was a psychologist as a translator. I wasn't being called as a psychologist. Somebody knew that I spoke Spanish, and so they said that I could be of some help. Ricky, the 7-year-old, and Socorro, the 60-year-old great aunt. Well, so let's look first at the cultural diversity in dealing with a sick child. Ricky and his great aunt were relying on religion, praying, on ethnic foods that are comforting, like bringing it to the hospital, and a protective parenting styles. The hospital staff was relying on medical pragmatism, on institutional standard food, and physical activation after an operation. That's what they meant by she should be walking him around in the. And then in terms of sociopolitical location, Ricky and the great aunt were Latinx. The reason that I put it in question mark, I never want to really pronounce that is how people identify themselves, because sometimes they might say white, sometimes they might say Mexicans, sometimes they might say a person of color. So she's a woman, she is poor, she has low education, she's immigrant status, and her language is monolingual Spanish. The hospital staff has white privilege, and mostly males, middle and upper class people, higher education, native citizens, and English. So one renders on the left-hand side powerless to complain. The other one is entitled to blame, which We see this as blaming the victim as often. Sometimes I ask people, and I don't know in this webinar situation, how many of you do you feel, if it was possible to raise your hands, how many of you feel that this situation, remember this is early 1970s, maybe middle in 1970s. Could this happen today? How many of you think that it could happen today? Or have we made a lot of progress when it comes to cultural diversity and sociopolitical location? Is it possible to see people or no? Or because they're, okay, so that's all right. You can tell me later.
A few people are putting their fingers up.
Or you can do in the chat, yes or no. Okay. All right. So
they're saying yes. They're saying yes.
Yes. Well, this is interesting to me because when I give a workshop live and I present this, many people say yes. And I didn't put it in the second edition of the book. I just mentioned it because I assume that we have made a lot of progress. Because this was a long analysis. Okay, but what it inspired in me is the idea that we need to look at two different and related aspects, and we often have conflated them. The idea of cultural diversity as having to do with values, beliefs, and meaning differences, such as they come from ethnicity, religion, nationality, as we saw in Ricky's great aunt, but also, as we saw in Ricky's great aunt and the hospital staff, there's the issue of social justice, the power and access to resources, the differences in gender, race, and class that could lead to discrimination. And you will see as we move on that each one has its own tools for intervention in clinical situations. And that's why it's important to have them separately. I will just mention them here very briefly, that the cultural diversity one in terms of therapy practices, but again, I will illustrate this. It calls for curiosity and respect for culture-specific adaptations and for transformations of mainstream theory. What do I mean by that? It was so quick on the part of the hospital staff to think that, or particularly the psychiatrists, that the great aunt would resent taking care of a child because he had a model of a biological mother, a young biological mother taking care of a young biological child, a nuclear family model. So we need to really see how much our theories are applicable to other groups. In terms of social justice, the therapy practices would be empowerment, cultural resistance, social action, legitimize local knowledge, and in cases where people cannot, like the case of the great aunt, to consider advocacy for our clients. Okay? So let me now move on to approaches to culture and therapy. So when I first started working on this topic, I thought that there were several ways in which people were looking at culture. A universalist way, the psychiatrist in our example exemplifies that, a position that states that all individuals are more alike than they are different. This is probably true. We are very much alike. We all humans share 99.9% of our DNA sequences. So it's very likely that we also share some similar psychological processes. All babies in the world are raised by adults to whom they become attached and from whom they eventually separate. The problem with staying with this position only is that we tend to consider as universal the standards of one dominant race, one dominant social class or family form, like the psychiatrist did, right? And attribute pathology to other forms. What is a particularist position? Well, this position states this, just like our fingerprints, one, remember, was the DNA. The other one is that are similar in us, but our fingerprints are really different for each one of us. It's sort of like a miracle, right? That's why we can put our thumb in a document and it's going to be different than everybody else's. Well, all persons are also more different than they are alike in some ways. So good counseling always requires getting deeply involved with each person's uniqueness. But if we just stay with this position, we cannot make any generalizations. We ignore the impact of society on psychological distress and make the person's interior process responsible for everything that is happening. So, and the ethnic specific position is probably the one that you're most familiar with when it comes to culture, that says attends to cultural diversity by describing predictable values, customs, and behaviors, such as, for example, um, you know, of machismo or male dominance in Latinos, expressing emotionality or conflict in Italians, obedience in Asians, religion and spirituality in African Americans. I don't object, totally to this, but I will tell you what I think are very serious limitations of thinking that way. And I think, unfortunately, many cultural competent courses are still equate culture with ethnicity only. And the problem with doing that is that by doing that, we may perpetuate stereotypes because values are constantly in flux. I can give you lots of examples of that. I mean, the Mexico or the Mexican clients I used to have 20 years ago are quite different than today in terms of many, many different aspects of family life. And they're also very much contextual. We can't just say there is a Mexican client, there is a Puerto Rican client. We have to specify class, education, nationality, whether a person comes from an urban or a rural area. So, and Latinos come from many different countries and generations. And in addition to which, many Asians, Latinos, African Americans have bicultural and multicultural identities. That is a tremendous change today. How many people come from mixed marriages and they have bicultural identities, or they have lived in different places and they have multicultural identities. Plus, we're all exposed to many different cultures through television, through reading, many things. And I also believe that similar values exist in many patriarchal cultures. So to divide them up and study each one separately is maybe problematic. So what I came up with is an idea that we have to look at multidimensionality, that we have to look at culture in multidimensional ways, and we also have to look at context in terms of ecological approach. And so you will see that I will spend the rest of my time talking and applying MECA. And I think that's important when it comes to supervision and multicultural supervision, which is really the topic today, because when you take a universalist approach, you have no use for multicultural supervision. If you take a particularist approach, you don't have any use for multicultural. I mean those approaches only, right? If you don't add other approaches. If you take an ethnic focus approach, well, you will take courses and lectures with a specific ethnic group content. But if you look at things from a multidimensional ecological comparative approach, then you would learn about a diversity in form, systems, domains that allow for comparative maps. And the comparative maps could be across cultures, and it could be comparing the therapist with the supervisor and the therapist with the client, and including the supervisor with the client. And so I know I wish I had come up with a simpler way of a better name for this, because it's a kind of a big name, multicultural ecological comparative approach. So sometimes by the time I'm halfway into this, people want to know what MECA is, but this because they can't remember multidimensional ecological comparative approach, but MECA means this. It means this way of looking at things in which culture is seen in a multidimensional way, which means it has to do with multiple identities and multiple social locations. I'm convinced that there's no such a thing as a Latino client or the Black family or the Chinese family, that you really have to, or even the immigrant client, as there is as much variability within groups as there is between groups. So and I believe that you're already doing that when you are seeing your supervisee and the supervisee is telling you about the culture of the client that they're seeing, that they will give you a mosaic. And, and if they don't, you as a supervisor should say, tell me more. So this person is Latino or Latinx. From where? What is their level of education? What is their religion? It isn't true anymore that most Latinx people are Catholics. Many are now Protestants. And so I would like to know that. And what is their social class? What is their race and their color? And so what is their occupation? What is their gender, sexual orientation? So I would like to know that. And it doesn't take that long. It really doesn't. It's what anthropologists call a thick description, not a thin one. If you say one or two things, you're giving a thin description. You want a thick description so that you get to know people more. And so there is, and this unique combination of multiple identities and contexts creates cultural borders. Once you know more, that, for instance, I believe that all of you that you're hearing me, that we probably share already some cultural borders. We all work or have worked in community mental health centers. We all share probably egalitarian views about gender issues. We're all against things like hitting children. So we share a lot of values, and which means we share cultural borders. And it's important in terms of understanding the ecological niche of our clients too, is because we need to focus on similarities and not just on cultural differences. People who are mothers or have grandchildren, they already have a similarity with the client in front of you, even if you're from a different culture. So we could look briefly, if we look at the definition of culture I gave you, at my own. I will actually be, you will get to know more about me through the presentation. So I'm a native Spanish speaker, and I will tell you later why. And I come from a very large urban area. I'm white. I went from lower, completely uneducated parents to being middle class and upper middle class today. Upper in the sense of having more resources. I'm Latin American, and I grew up Jewish. And so I have an education as a PhD. You see, I have all these things, but you do too. So, and when you are doing this work, you could see, for example, I put disability in my immediate family. Yes, I have, very close people to me, in my own set of children and grandchildren, something that I can empathize in terms of families that have disability. Yeah. So my personal ecological niche, I can also do it this way rather than the other, is to say that I'm Argentine, I'm a naturalized American, I'm a woman, I'm white. I'm first child born in Latin America of Eastern European immigrants. And so I'm an immigrant to the US. I've been a widow for 28 years. And so you can see that I have a lot of things I can put that form my cultural and ecological niche. Then I would have to also say, particularly in supervision, what is my theoretical niche? That I'm a human development graduate, that's where my PhD is from. Was client-centered Rogerian clinical psychologist. I'm a family therapist, and I have current experience, past and current experience with community clinical work. Okay. And so I also wanted very much to integrate in MECA migration-specific competencies. Carol referred to the book that we edited together. One of the chapters of the book on multiculturalism and diversity in clinical supervision is about migration-specific competencies. Because again, in cultural competence courses, we tend to have this more fixed views about culture and not enough about the impact of immigration on immigrants, yeah? And or people even who marry immigrants. So So MECA is a culturally and socially responsive approach that integrates culture, context, and migration-specific competencies. Well, I mean, it would be unwieldy if I would have to do, say, an essay on every one of those things that I put in the culture. And so I add, and the culture slide, right? So I ask myself, what differences make a difference for understanding various ethnic and minority groups in a non-stereotypical manner and even a comparative manner? And I came up with 4 things that most likely sort of give me away as a family systems therapist. And these are migration acculturation, ecological context, family life cycle, and family organization. And I will look deeply at each one of those. And I will also say that the family maps can be constructed using these 4 dimensions or domains, and that the practitioner's map can be looked at the same way, but it also requires a self-examination in terms of theory and training and personal in terms of maps, just like I did a minute ago. I said to myself, what are my theories and training, and what is my personal ecological niche? So are you following me so far? Do you have any questions? Are you with me?
There was a comment, people are saying yes, but they say culture is a constellation, said Kirk.
Oh, good. Yes, I agree. Yes, it's a constellation, a mosaic. I agree. Okay. So, and you will get all of this, so you don't have to worry about copying or anything. But so you will see that in a MECA map, each one of those 4 domains are now fleshed out, and you can, they could be even a lot more fleshed out. I have tables to do that. And you will see that on the left-hand side, are you seeing this mirror in the same way?
Share the screen.
Huh?
You forgot to share the screen, I think.
Oh, no. Guys, I'm screen sharing.
Oh.
According to this, I'm screen sharing.
Can people see the screen? It was working perfectly before. Oh, you can. Everyone but me can. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. And so the four quadrants are fleshed out now. And if you look at the left-hand side, the side of migration, acculturation, and ecological context, those are where we're going to discover most issues that have to do with power differences, with discrimination, with racism, because that's where they take place. They take place in the school, in the church, at work, in the community settings, in the society, basically. And then migration acculturation, there is also a lot of issues that come from being disempowered by that experience and by the reception, the anti-immigrant reception that many suffer. And then on the family life cycle and family organization, it would have to do with cultural value differences or cultural diversity, right? So that also makes it somewhat more clear what I meant by cultural diversity and social justice having their own domains and their own interventions. So a family MECA map, are you okay with the screen now? Are you all seeing the screen?
People say yes.
Okay. So a family MECA map is a tool for integrating the 4 dimensions of culturally attuned assessment. And what do I mean by that? That those 4 areas that I fleshed out, you could also do it by when you're with a family, or do it in different ways. You could have a big piece of paper and do it together, or you could do it in your own to explore, or you could do it without the quadrants, just write it out, to say, what is the migration narrative there? What has happened to people where they migrated? Where do they live now? What is their family organization presently, and maybe the one they came from? And what is the life cycle stage that they're on? So I'm going to present a case, and I'm going to stay with that case throughout to illustrate different things. So this case is a case of a little girl who Yolanda, who's 6 years old, and who came to therapy referred by a young therapist who was consulting with me about this family. She saw them in a community mental health center and and was able to get quite a bit of information that had to do with separations and reunifications of the family at different points that you will see in a minute. They lived in an isolated trailer park. They're underemployed. They feel discriminated by the school and the CPS report. Why? Because the therapist got involved through a CPS report that was unclear, and the father the entire family was asked to be in therapy and to also take a parenting course. I'll come back to all of this, but I want to read to you what was the migration. So Victor, who's the father, had initially come to California on his own. He had found small jobs at less than minimum wage. Hopeful, that he could make a living here, he returned home to marry Isabel, and both came back to the US. This was slightly before, the current administration were going back and forth it became impossible. So he went home to San Luis de Potosí, and they both came back to the U.S. He was so happy about this, and he kept on saying to Isabel that now they could have a couch, they could have nice furniture, they could have a better life here. She became pregnant soon after, and they got concerned that they would not be able to manage financially with a new baby, that she could no longer continue to work as a maid, a housekeeper that she was doing. So they returned to Mexico. Very soon, their economic situation there became a lot worse. So Victor urged Isabel to leave their baby, Yolanda, in Mexico with Juana, his mother. Isabel was very reluctant, but agreed that in this way she could continue to work in the U.S. She really did not want to do this, but under pressure she relented. So 4 years later, Isabel was pregnant again, and they went back to get Yolanda, but the grandmother resisted and was supported by Victor. So these are all the back and forth, the migrations and reunifications. A year later, Isabel this time prevailed, arguing that Yolanda needed to start school. So the pregnancy with the second child was not enough, but the needing to start school, yes. And so as soon as the 6-year-old Yolanda arrived from Mexico, she began to throw tantrums and throw up during meal times. In fact, if we go into really what is it that the father did that was so objectionable, and apparently he only did it once, was he demanded that she eat the food that she had just thrown up. And so she disliked many foods and often refused to eat. And she also resisted calling her parents mother and father, and she believed them to be her siblings. So if we look at what are the salient issues in the 4 domains, we can see that we have the separations and reunifications, of mother and father with Yolanda, or the grandmother Yolanda with the grandmother, and we can see that they live in an isolated trailer park, and that they are underemployed, and then they are in the early stages of marriage. They have a lot of loyalty towards the family of origin. The transition to school for Yolanda is a very important part of this, and the strong bonds with paternal grandmother and high contact with country of origin, and then we'll see what I mean by family nuclearization due to migration. So how do we use the 4 domains? Well, to conduct an exploratory inquiry of each domain, to identify the stressors and the strengths, and to develop some sense of what are the areas clients may need help or may be tied to the presenting problem. So I will leave the case for a little bit and come back to it so that I can tell you more about how to do this. So the practice encounter is not culturally neutral. So the first thing we have to encounter here is the fact that the therapist is going to have their own views as to what's happening to this family. And we will see what they are when I tell you about the therapist that we're seeing the family. And but I think if you agree with this, that the therapist is going to bring their own maps, that this is actually a cultural encounter, not a neutral encounter. We would have to add the idea that you can't just say that I'm culturally competent. You have to be culturally humble. And what I mean by that is that the practitioner has to have self-reflection about his own culture, his own class, his race, his beliefs and values. And that the clients, in many ways, are the experts on their culture and context. And so if the practitioners become aware of power dynamics and their relationship with clients, they will be much more open to be curious and respectful. So if we apply MECA to clinical practice and supervision, we would have to say we have to do a MECA map for the family, MECA map for the therapist, and a MECA map for the supervisor. It is less overwhelming than it feels, than it sounds. You will see, because in many ways you repeat the contents and see how you can compare. So the therapists make a map. How do we do it? Well, we simply do this. We compare. And there's a template for this that, it's very easy to get, or you could do it your own way. But if you have this template in mind, you would be able to say, well, did I ever experience migrations, separations, or in any kind of relocation, or did I always stay in the same place? Did I ever live in a trailer park, or did I always have a home? Did I ever feel discriminated by by school or by work? Or, do I have a situation where I'm extremely loyal to my family of origin? So you could develop empathy and a sense of concordance or discordance with the family if you fill this out. Awareness of power issues is very important. And I understand also that my age, my color, my writings, my position may be a distancer. And so I'm aware of possible intimidation in the supervision. And I want to tell you just a little anecdote about that has to do with my experiences with being Argentine. And perhaps many of you know, or I don't know how much is generational, about Salvador Minuchin. And so when I first met him, I thought that he and I would have some similarities because we're Argentines, and I wanted very much to be a family therapist. So I approached him at a conference, and he was completely indifferent and basically almost said it just like I'm going to say it. The fact that you're Argentine doesn't give you any privileges. And like you have to prove yourself in some other way. He was just like, he didn't even remember me anymore. So that affected me very much, and it pulled me away. It really, I felt I had to do my own thing. So I'm very aware that when you acquire a certain kind, of course I'm not Minuchin, but I'm old and I have written, so I realized that I have to be especially careful to be supportive. And so, and I do have a different experience many years later with Minuchin. And that is when he's watching a videotape that I did in a supervisory situation at the Florida Child Guidance Clinic. My supervisor was very critical. She didn't like the fact that, I don't know if you can see this, that I had a folder like this, and when I was seeing the family. And she was really, my supervisor was like, and she said it in front of Minuchin, who was the supervisor of supervisor. She said, she's so scared by the situation. Like, look, how is she going to connect with the family? How is she going to, it's like she's just, making notes and looking at her like this is not right. She's not joining, kind of thing. And Minuchin didn't say anything at all. No? So then he looks like 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later into the tape. He asks, can you roll the tape? And so he thinks about it and he says, oh no, she's going somewhere. She's slowly, in her soft voice, she's going somewhere. She knows where she's going. She talks to the mother, she talks to the child. She knows what she's doing. And it just made a tremendous amount of difference to me. It was like I went from feeling that I didn't know what I was doing to feeling that I had some strengths. So I'm going to do that with Maggie, even though she had difficulties with this family. I don't know how much did I cover them, but she didn't like how she thought the father was a machista in Latina terms, that the wife was too quiet, that he was, you'll see, I think, because I'm going to tell more, that he is sort of pathologically attached to his mother. And so I just thought that she was trying to acquire the information very well, and I told her that. And then I asked her something that I ask for almost everybody, is to come up with some things that I would like her to think about. And so in supervision, once we look at the family's MECA together, I generally ask the therapist to make 3 guesses as to where the focus of the work needs to be, in which one of the 4 domains. And there's no right or wrong here, no judgment. The issue is that it may be a useful way to approach the problem, not whether one is right or wrong. Is it going to be useful to do this? So the therapist comes up with 3 guesses. 1, the parents were not sufficiently bonded to the girl because crucial years of separation. The father had a pathological attachment to his mother and could not separate from her. The wife was too subservient and needed to become more assertive. So she is coming up with 3 things that are interesting, that they're all possible. And so I encouraged her to think about, okay, these are interesting hypotheses, they're interesting. How would you go about exploring each one of them? Okay. How would you be curious and come up with more and see which one of this you can put your weight on? So, but I had some preferences, which I will say to her later. So, what parts of MECA do you think these 3 hypotheses fall into? Migration, ecological context, family life cycle, family organization. We could look at them again if you want to. Go back. Parents are not sufficiently bonded to the girl because of the crucial years of separation. Is that migration? Is that ecological context? Is that family organization? The father had a pathological attachment to his mother and could not separate from her. The wife was too subservient and needed to become more assertive. So again, which may be going on? Well, the therapist's guesses, in my opinion, were, the first one was migration. The second, and that same one, the crucial years of separation, that's family life cycle. Something was lost in the family life cycle, right? The time that they would be together. The father had a pathological attachment to his mother, that would be family organization, right? It comes in the lower quadrant of cultural diversity, and she thinks, because the therapist is thinking in terms of nuclear family and separations that come with autonomy, and is he too attached to the mother at the time of migration that she leaves a child with her? So, and the wife is too subservient and needed to become more assertive is because she's supportive of the husband. And that again, is what is the place of the couple in the extended family? That's family organization. Okay. So now I'll tell you what the three guesses are for me as a supervisor, as a MECA supervisor, with my own biases, right? Well, I vote myself for the first one, not only because I'm interested in migration, but because this family has so many separations and reunifications. I think that has had an impact, and that perhaps it has had an impact on the knowledge they have of each other over 6 years of separation. The father has a pathological attachment. Well, I think is that useful? Well, I think it could lead me to blaming the father as having a deficit, as being sort of too baby, too close to his mother, too unable to see who the real mother is. And knowing something about culture and three-generational attachments, that would make me feel that calling it pathological is blaming. And three, the wife is too subservient and needed to become more assertive. Again, I think I'd be careful with the stereotype here. And just as an aside, I just want to tell you that I have written a paper on men, on Latino men, and that shows that machismo is a little more complicated than this, wild men who dominate women. That there are men who are like that. There's no doubt, but there's also good men. There's also good men. It's not like what Trump says. It's like all bad men. And so there's a part of me that reserves some judgment, and particularly in this case, I tell you why. Because Isabel, the wife, when she's asked in the therapy about what she thought about Victor's insistence of leaving the child with the mother, what she answers is, I understood it. I understood it because Juana, the grandmother, she would have died of sadness if we had not left her. And so he was being a good son, even though I didn't want that. I wanted to have my daughter, but also I know that I had to work. And so I knew that eventually she would come to me. Okay. And so so it is also important to have a sort of, I would say, a treatment plan that focuses on what the problem is now. What I mean by useful is you have to do something. You have an obligation to the family and to the your supervisee to be efficient, to be focused, to really have results. And to me, the results here have to do with the child not being taken away, by having the open chance of what Child Protective Services did to give them the chance to be in therapy and do parenting in a different way, and to get the parents not polarized on this, and focus on the present, on the food issue, on what happened while they were separated. To me, I would vote for one. Okay, not the others. I will fear that the therapy would not be efficient in terms of what the presenting problem is. So what I do with the supervisee is to encourage sociological imagination. I ask her to imagine the couple and their family's state of mind when the son departed, when he came back, when he got married and left again with his wife, when he came back after having the baby, but the couple left again without the baby, when they came back to take the baby, but did not, and coming back again and now took the baby. So further, I ask her if thinking about her parents as young immigrants may be of some help in her understanding of this family, what the losses were. Okay? So I think sociological imagination is an important part of supervision. that I think will encourage curiosity about the four aspects of uh, MECA. And so people learn to ask questions, rather than making statements. I think asking and not assuming is very important. That to me is the advantage of not having cultural competence defined as ethnicity, because somehow competence means we know. We don't need to ask. We know that that's going on. Well, we always need to ask. And so, what was the migration like for the mother, for the father, for Yolanda? So many times when children are reunified, we don't understand that they are new immigrants themselves with many losses and many new adaptations. Um, just in passing, I should say that Yolanda did not miss Mexican food. His mother, her grandmother, did not cook Mexican food. She gave her a lot of candy. And what the mother wasn't giving her was candy, because the mother was a great Mexican cook. So again, one has to ask, what food, what food could she be missing? What food was she getting? And so, and the parents knew. And also what the migration is like for the grandmother. I mean, we cannot not have this larger view of immigration involving many people, not just the people that we're seeing. Those who are left behind are part of the immigration system. Okay, and so, and trauma events in reunited children are very common. So. Could Yolanda have been involved in any kind of pre-migration when the parents came back and then left, during the separation in the home country, during the migration in transit? We don't know. These are things that need to be asked. So a migration-related intervention was, for the therapist, wondered if Yolanda could be nerviosa, which means nervous, reacting to the migration losses. So she was taking a somewhat psychoeducational approach with the family and saying, so is Yolanda okay when, when she reacts, when she throws the food? Could she be nervous? She's lost a lot of things, familiar places, foods, objects, especially her grandmother. Her eating disorder could be a somatization for stress, a connection the parents could understand culturally right away. Right away. I mean, culturally, Mexicans understand very well that stomach aches, headaches, that they could be representing emotions like sadness, for instance. So Yolanda's parents became more sympathetic towards their daughter's situation. The mother began to see Yolanda for herself rather than feeling so rivalry with her grandmother-in-law. She was, inevitably, of course, rivalrous with her mother-in-law. So the girl wanted to go back to the grandmother and not be with her, which may have been true, But she began to be more sympathetic towards the girl. I want to say something here that it's, again, it comes from having studied migration-related competencies, that there's also possible trauma after reunification. And if we look at migration, which hopefully we'll have enough time to look at each quadrant and learn a little bit more, you will see that I will talk about separations and reunifications, but I wanted to put it here because it does relate to this family. Is there a possibility of a risk of child physical abuse at reunification? And we don't have a research, but I have seen it quite a bit. And so it is possible that the parents are frustrated with a child that is rebellious, that doesn't obey, that is going through difficult emotional times. And they think that if they're strong or they are tough with the children, that they will obey them, that they will, they will take over back their position as parents. And that is very sad, because that's precisely when children need the opposite, when they need to have nurturing parents to rebuild or repair the bond. And child protective service workers may see physical discipline as a cultural trait, saying, oh, well, all this, Latinx or all these Mexicans in particular, oh, they hit their children. And they do not integrate migration-specific competencies, not in the parents' positions as immigrants, not in the child that is reunified. Okay? And so you would say, well, how do I get these ideas? Well, it's information in each MECA domain. And so it is how we arrive at ideas on how to conceptualize what may be going on. So I will move into that. And I will come back as we go to the other quadrants, to the case to continue to illustrate things. So let me just look briefly at the migration quadrant and migration and other types of separations too, because not all of you work with immigrants, I imagine, but you may work with other types of separations. And so when somebody leaves, somebody stays behind. Separation is at the core of migration and at the core of many problems related to poverty. So what are those? Well, detention, deportation, foster care, physical or sexual abuse, neglect, incarceration, substance abuse, crime, violence, mental illness, and fair accusations. All of this can present times of separation for families, times where people come back together through treatment or other ways. So when it comes to migration-specific competencies, there are many types of relational stresses. And I won't go into each one of them, but I just wanted to show you that for each one of these, there's also some suggestions of possible clinical practices. I am only concentrating today on separations and reunifications because of this case and because it would be too much to give you, something that should be more part of a much longer seminar or course. So I'm going to only concentrate on separations, reunifications. So when it comes to immigration, separations, reunifications in the past, we know that it used to be that grandparents and extended family were the ones left behind. Then the father left alone, leaving mother in charge of the children. I want to just mention to you that sometimes in supervision, I direct people to, direct is the wrong word. I suggest that people look at documentaries or different ways in which they can develop better understanding and empathy. So this is a PBS special that I like a lot and that one can get the videotape is called The New Americans. And they have different type people that come from different countries. And this one is a family called Pedro Flores family. I don't know if you can see that I wrote down in the photographs, Pedro Flores. And it's a family that after 13 years of Pedro having immigrated to Kansas, to Garden City, Kansas, where there's a lot of slaughterhouses and a lot of Mexican immigrants go and work there, he's able to secure sponsors to finally, and he would just only go back once a year. So it's a very good documentary, not only to understand what happens to the family, but to different family members. The reactions of the mother after having left a place where she had become basically a single parent and come back to a situation where she has now, vacuum cleaners and different things she never had before. And she doesn't, she can't adapt. And you will see the lack of understanding of all of this by the school who has gotten attached to the children. So it's a very interesting thing that could, if it fits with the families you're seeing, it's a good idea to be knowledgeable as a supervisor of tools that people would enjoy, actually, because it's a very entertaining movie. Yeah.
Dr. Falikov, there's a comment. Currently, with the health crisis in regards to separation, my thought was COVID, essential workers that have left to work, children being sent off to family due to parent guardian illness, families that have not been able to travel back home to the U.S. out of the country to family due to COVID. And someone else asked you to repeat the name of the documentary the new Americans, I think. The new
Yes,
Americans.
Americans.
Anyway, with respect to the comment and COVID and all the separations.
Yes. Well, I wish that I could answer that question. I think it's an excellent question, but I need to make clear that the community mental health center where I work, and it is very much part of the community, it's in one part of San Diego that is basically uh, immigrants that have been there for a long time. And I just dare say here, with which I usually don't publicly, people that don't have sufficient documentation, although they may be in process, they are people who have not, they're not at the border, they're not in detention, they're not, so I'm talking of families that have suffered all the separations over the years, and many that cannot be reunified, but they could not be reunified anyhow, because since the Family Reunification Act has been a total disaster in terms of allowing peaceable documentation. It is actually the lack of government legality about this that doesn't allow people to reunify today. And so it has been going on for many years, and it's worse. But if I would be happy to leave time at the end if any of you are actually working with families that are experiencing COVID-19 and that they're unable to, if I understand the question correctly, what is the impact on your treatment or your supervision of these situations? I'd be happy to try to figure that out with you. But this work here is with families that are stabilized in the United States and occasionally have the luck, say, of being able to reunify. But not the people that are in detention at the border, because we have no access to them. We really don't. So at least, in San Diego, we have been unable to do anything, even medically. People are, even medically, people are no longer right now really being examined for things like the flu. So it's really disastrous. So, okay, so what has happened over time is new forms of separations and reunifications. By the way, the case that we just saw is father and mother, right? Father and mother are father and mother left by themselves and left the child alone with the grandmother. But what we have is the ratio of Latina and Filipino women to men is very high. It's equal or higher to men now. And so this is a New York Times photograph of 2005. So this has been going on for a long time, that women have been coming on their own, leaving children under the care of relatives. And we have what is called the feminization of migration, sociologically speaking. And as you can see in the photograph, the woman with the black purse is coming over and choosing one or two women to take home to do her work and to do her housework, and she may or may not pay them. And so there's a lot of abuse on the work of these women, but usually they have done it in a very sacrificial way to be able to feed their children, to send sustenance and remittance to their mothers or their sisters that are taking care of their children, to buy school supplies, different things. And so one or more children are left behind in the care of relatives, and children traveling alone, mostly motivated by reunification. We know that has been happening too. And some of you may have been working with unaccompanied minors. So But the reason I want to talk about this, and it may relate somewhat to the question about COVID-19, is that an additional important element in modern migrations is ICT. ICT stands for Information Communication Technologies, and they offer some repair in the midst of relational ruptures and barriers, and some barriers into bridges, right? And so what do I mean by that? Well, the power of connection in the midst of separation and suffering was what I have called repeatedly living with two hearts instead of a broken heart. I mean, the truth is that mobile phones and all, have absolutely changed our lives. And Latinos, African American, Asians, and whites use technologies of communication almost equally. Immigrants use it for family transnational communication. And so Latinos are actually quite savvy about this. The Pew Center for Studies in February of 2018 published a very interesting statistic of 97% of Latinx have a cell phone. 77% are smartphones, but mostly text. And 20% have a cell phone, but no smartphones. Mostly text means they don't use the internet. That immigrants are part of a large relationship system, and those who stayed behind still live within us. So, and we live in always inquire about those who stayed behind. Sometimes a family might say to you, you say, how many children do you have? They say 3. And you say, you have 3 here. Is that all you have? You have more children? Oh yeah, I have 3 more back home. Then you know that there are people who stayed behind that are very, very important, right? And so, so it's important to always add that, not just all those who left and those who come and go, but those who stayed behind. So we live in a technological world, and therapy can also make use of technologies of communication to facilitate connections between separated family members. I know that there are issues of being HIPAA compliant and that hurdles that need to be faced in relation to that. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to say that it really is possible to do, and that today, in today's atmosphere with COVID-19, actually HIPAA has become much more relaxed in terms of using phones rather than Zoom for minority populations that don't have computers. So,
Falikov, there's been a few questions or comments.
Okay, perfect.
One is, does this, I think it means framework, apply to other cultures over the time that have been separated similar in regards to migration, if outside the U.S. in origin? That's one. And this, should I give you both?
If they're related, yes, but I can answer this one, and I think it's an extremely important question, and it's my mistake not to have said that, because I have so many, because my main description of a case today is Latinx, but absolutely, I'm very glad that you asked me this question, because I think MECA is not about a particular culture. It's about, it can be applied to African Americans, although the migration issue takes a different approach, but certainly Middle Easterns, certainly a lot of Asian Americans. It is very applicable to many types of Asian Americans, many types of East Indians. It is absolutely applicable. Yes, thank you for asking the question. Yeah.
And the second is, thank you. It's so important to take into consideration the relationship South-North, North-South. It changes so much with the perspective. Wonderful to apply the MECA model. And that's from Maria Del Pilar.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's nice to get commentaries from you. And if there's things that are not clear too, please. I'm very happy to. I also know that we are going to have a break at some point, right? Can you tell me when that is? So that I stop it.
In 7 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So so the clinical presentations in parent-child separations and reunifications, during separation, we may see in our clinical practices depressed solo mothers that may be treated with medication or support. We do not know how the children are doing back home. But during reunification, which is much more common in terms of clinical presentations, is a depressed, resentful, rebellious child that is referred with a mother who may lack experience, empathy, or ability to set limits. This also happens at reunification after a mother has been in rehab or detox, or so it applies to other situations of separation. So I want to just mention, although I won't elaborate on it, that there is a lot of different clinician practices that we could apply during separation as we learn them, and practices to be used during reunification. And I'm just only going to name them. And so practices for children's care during separation. I think the book Families of the Poor by Menuchin, which by the way is Patricia Menuchin, his wife, and Colapinto and Sal Menuchin, published in 2007, Families of the Poor, working with families of the poor. It's a great book, and it has a lot of cases by children in kinship foster care, and I can see a lot of similarities between kinship foster care and leaving children with grandparents. That is not a formalized foster care, but is very similar in many ways. And in terms of, and the importance of maintaining connections between the mother, the caregiver, and the child, how the quality of relationships, how to shift negative triangles into positive ones, and how to explore the family approval for the separated mother or father. Is the family or the grandmother is very critical towards the mother or the grandfather for whatever the reasons for separation are, the difficulties in the therapy become much greater, and we need to know how to handle them. So, and in terms of practices of reunification, it's important to make meaning out of the separation, to repair the bond, to restore a strength-based family story, to restore role clarity, to explore trauma, and to acknowledge fears of future separation. Many children, and I think including Yolanda, it would be afraid in this situation that they could get settled back and be separated again. So I think it's important to deal with all of that in therapy. And there's also specialized practices for reunifications, like catching up life narratives by doing storybooks with children, theater plays. Again, I can't really go into each one of this, but I just wanted to show you that once you get involved with of thinking about culture and sociopolitical frames, that there are ways of bringing that into therapy and into supervision. Okay, so catching up life narratives are really important to make, and are really easy to learn. And so let's go back to MECA, and now I want to take up the left. Are you seeing the same I see left and right, or is it turn the mirror? No. So on the left-hand side on the top is ecological context, right? And so we'll talk about the importance of that, and usually when we talk about culture and context, what we mean by context is the left-hand side, and culture, the right-hand side. So what is meant by ecological context that I summarized there very briefly, and the big one is community, living situations, work, schools, other institutions. I think social workers have always been wonderful at creating eco-maps, and eco-maps that involved looking at each one of these things. And again, it's sort of like the ecological context idea, that it gives you a flesh out again. I'm sure that when you are describing a case, you all describe this. It's just a reminder that you say something about the community, the friends, the housing, whether there's any legal involvement, whether there's discrimination, whether children's school, the neighborhood, all of that is just that we need to then apply it to a case. if we just say this and then go back to something about something is wrong with the attachment in the family between parent and children, and don't look at everything else, we have not done a complete service to the family, because it's more complicated, their ability to go in the directions that we think they should be going. So why is it relevant to talk about ecological and sociopolitical stresses in Yolanda's family? Why should Maggie pay attention to that? And what does Victor say? Because usually you just have to learn to hear it. A client might say, because for people like us, and then you have to say, tell me more. What do you mean by people like us? And so he does say that. He says, the little girl, Magdalena, who is 2, now is being taken by Isabel, the mother, to a factory where she found a job. The factory has a nursery, so she can take Magdalena with her. She cannot take Yolanda. Yolanda has to be in school, but school ends at 2:30 or 3 o'clock. Magdalena cannot pick her up until 5. So, I'm sorry, Isabel cannot pick her up until 5. So they need daycare. They need childcare in the school. What the father says is that he feels discriminated by the school, that the school hasn't taken their request for childcare seriously, and that what they have said is, you're not in the waiting list. And we have a long waiting list. And he is a little bit doubtful as to whether he doesn't remember anybody telling him that he needed to put himself in the waiting list, and he doubts that there's such a long waiting list. So he tells us that. He tells that to the therapist. And that both, they suspect discrimination, but they really are certain about the discrimination when the school sends CPS. And so he is furious. He's not at all any kind of, typical stereotype of being submissive, not at all. And I've known lots of people who are not, lots of people who try to stand up for their rights, and he's one of them. So he says, this is wrong. This is wrong. I didn't hit her. I just, just like forced her. Yes, she went to school crying, all of that. But I didn't mean, and I had never done this before. They have something against me. So at this point, what he's talking about is that something that we as therapists have to take into account, and the connection between personal and social stresses. You want me to stop?
I want to take a break. I'm sorry. There's no good time.
Okay. I forgot. I'm sorry. It's my fault. So,
no, it's fine.
So we'll stop here.